Hi, my name is Ryan Enan, and as part of my oral presentation, I will be covering the case of Ashgrove Proprietary Limited versus the Deputy Federal Commissioner of Tax. This case was held on the 31st of August 1994 at the Federal Court of Australia. This case consisted of 5 different taxpayers that were heard together to determine if the amounts received by the taxpayers' income, according to ordinary concepts, royalty or were they capital. Each of the taxpayers was a party to one or more agreements concerning the sale of timber. The 5 cases consist of the following taxpayers: Mrs. Gooch, Ashgrove Proprietary Limited, Mr. Swain, Mr. Wadley, and Mr. Davey. So, each of these taxpayers received an amended assessment from the Commissioner stating increasing their assessable income initially by a certain amount, and obviously the taxpayers weren't happy with that and they objected against these certain amounts. The Commissioner then disallowed all objections for the taxpayers, which forced the taxpayers to appeal to court. Before I go into the facts and conclusions of each of the cases of the 5 taxpayers, I would like to mention some of the sections that may be relevant and you would like to look into while listening to me. The first section would be Part 3A of the Income Tax Act 1936, as well as Section 160M and 160M-6, 160M-7. These are regarding the tax losses of tax capital gains and losses. Alright, let's start with the first taxpayer, Mrs. Gooch. So if you've read my summary, you know that the total of $21,800 was included in her assessable income by the Commissioner, which she objected to, and obviously the Commissioner disallowed her objection and they both went to court. So if you've read my summary, you'll know how the $21,800 came along, as she got into a contract with North Broken Hill Limited by selling timber. Now, what we have to ask ourselves, if her intentions were to carry on a business or make profits or generate revenue. Now, if you've read the case or you've read my summary, you know the facts are clear in Mrs. Gooch. She was not, when she bought the land, obviously it was clear that her intentions were not for business or profit-making purposes. She just bought the land which had some timber on it, which means that it was a capital asset. Now, even though the land was a capital asset, you'll also see in the case that she entered into more than one agreement. But in terms of that, her motivations were quite clear. It was that she needed capital, she specifically stated that, and she was in need of money rather than continuing on a business and consistently making profits. She was just after that one-off payment of capital. Now, another big test in this case that was outlined was one of her agreements, which was a timber harvesting arrangement, where the purchaser provided the self-regeneration of timber on the land. Now, this is very relevant in determining if she was trying to carry on a business or not, but clearly she wasn't, because she proved to us that the regeneration of trees would not happen in her generation as the land conditions were bad. She was just providing for the future generations so the trees would go back and it would beautify the landscape. Therefore, in the case of Mrs. Gooch, it was clear that she was not trying to carry on a business, generate revenue, or create profit. It was just a one-off payment and of capital nature. Therefore, in her case, the proceeds from the sale of timber was not income in ordinary concepts. Now, Ashgrove Proprietary Limited was in a similar situation to Mrs. Gooch, in terms that the Commissioner gave him an amended assessment, increasing his assessable income, which he objected against. This objection was disallowed and they went to court. Now, in the case of Ashgrove, he also purchased a land with timber on it, and at that time it was clear that they had no profit-making consideration and or consideration of carrying on a business. Therefore, the land was a capital asset, just like Mrs. Gooch. Now, in terms of the agreements, Ashgrove entered into 2 agreements with the sale of timber. Again, that is not enough for us to assume that he is going to carry on a business or generate revenue or create profit. Now, in terms of the agreements, Mr. Brent Snehan, I think that's how you say it, one of the directors of the company, he specifically stated that at a point of the agreement, the purchaser was looking for timber around the area and Ashgrove simply had it available, thus making the one-off sale and entering into these agreements. Therefore, Ashgrove's land being a capital asset and them only entering into 2 agreements with one purchaser just for the fact that they had it available and the purchaser was looking for it, does not mean that Ashgrove was going to carry on business and continue making profits. Thus, therefore, it was found that the income of Ashgrove that they received was not income in ordinary concept. Now, in terms of Ashgrove and Mrs. Gooch, the High Court of Australia ordered that the application should be allowed, the objection decision set aside, and in place of theorem, objection allowed. Assessment remitted to respondent to be reassessed in accordance with law, and respondent to pay applicant's costs. Mr. Davies' case was very similar to the case of Ashgrove and Mrs. Gooch. This was because he also received a amended assessment from the Deputy Commissioner of Taxation. However, he received two this time regarding 2 different years. The first one was regarding income from his partnership that he entered with his wife, and the second one was regarding an agreement he entered in with North Broken Hill Limited. Now, with the purchase of his land that had timber on it, it was not enough to show that he had intention of carrying on a business, which means it was a capital asset. But in terms of the agreements, it also showed no intention of him carrying on a business or making a profit, as similarly to the other cases, it was shown that the agreements are just not enough. Now, the key difference in the case of Mr. Davey is the subsequent agreements he entered into relating the sale of timber. He didn't just stop with the initial agreements that he entered into. He kept on carrying into agreements for the sale of timber, which displayed his intentions of carrying out a business. Now, additionally, Mr. Davey also mentioned that he wished to start a plantation, which had a commercial purpose of selling timber, which clearly outlines the fact that he wants to carry on a business in terms of making profit. Thus, it was found that the proceeds from his sale were income according to ordinary concept. Now, obviously, in the case of Mr. Davey, the High Court of Australia dismissed his case. Those 3 cases were the important cases that I outlined in my summary in terms of a clear answer if the applicant should be dismissed or if the application should be allowed. Now, in my summary, I added in some additional information regarding Mr. Swain. In the case of Mr. Swain and Mr. Wadley, it was found that the individuals did not purchase the land for the sake of carrying on a business or making profit, or enter agreements for the sake of carrying on business or generating revenue. However, they were both paid considerably more than the lump sum which the agreements provided, and the amounts were not consistent with the agreements. Now, this is weird because they agreed on a certain amount, but they were paid considerably more. So the courts and everyone decided that the certain amounts received by the both individuals were not consistent with the agreements, so they were assessable and they were income under ordinary concepts. So their objection was allowed in part. The objection decision was to be set aside, and the assessment remitted to respond to be reassessed in accordance. Now, the legal principles of the case can be summarized by the tax ruling on the ATO website on TR-D6. It is basically a ruling on income tax for primary production. This ruling initially deals with income generated and whether it could be assessable relating to the forestry. From the facts, we've learned that the legal principles of surrounding this case are basically whether in these forestry operations or the sale of timber, especially timber stood on the land that it was purchased in, if the income is assessable or not. And that depends on the amount of the individual or the individual case, if it's carrying on a business or not. Now, the tax ruling provided on the ATO website TR-94-6 specifically gives you a criteria to follow in terms of if the forestry production business is carrying on a business or not. Now, the criteria in conjunction with the cases are still applicable to this day and can be used in any of the cases. I would like to add that these 5 cases can subject as a test case for tax practitioners today, which means that in terms of advice to their clients, they can relate the client's situation to the specific case. For example, if the client had no intention of business-making purposes in the forestry industry, then they could compare it to the case of Ashgrove. They can compare it to the case of Mrs. Gooch. And if that relates, then they know that there's a chance of success in terms of their objection and going to court. Now, if they find that their client's case is not relating to Mrs. Gooch or Ashgrove, it's more relating to Mr. Davey, or even Mr. Swain and Mr. Wadley, then the objection will be partly allowed or completely dismissed. Now, this case can be used in arguments, this case can be used in terms of test cases, and it could be used in junction to the ruling of TR 94-6. Now, to summarize the points of the case that we learned today was the fact that In terms of the forestry industry, it is important to distinguish if the person is carrying on a business or making a profit. I really did enjoy analyzing this case as it covered all aspects of the forestry industry in terms of carrying on a business. For example, Ashgrove and Mrs. Gooch, it was found that they'd had no intention and why they had no intention, thus the assessable income should not be included. Now, in terms of Mr. Swain and Mr. Wadley, it was found that they were partly guilty because of their lump sum payments, which were inconsistent with the contract. And lastly, we had Mr. Davy, who it was found that he had complete intention of carrying on a business and making profit. Thus, it means that income that they generated from the sale of timber should be assessable.